Hello, everyone. In this video lecture, we're going to be taking an overview of this entire course, the purposes behind this course, the intentions behind it, and we're going to start to discuss some of the basic terms and ideas that we're going to build upon as we progress through the semester, thinking about our final goal of developing an 800-word academic essay. One of the key things to take away, or one of the key things to understand about this course, is that every text that we're going to be encountering, in fact, every text, whether it be a newspaper article, a media text like a film, a television show, a news recording, or a standard text like a poem or a novella, every single one of them conveys arguments. Every single one of them has embedded within it a set of values and presumptions about the world that it seeks to articulate. Those values can be subtly embedded inside the work, such that we have to parse the work out and better understand what is going on and why. And sometimes those arguments or values and presumptions can be stated directly. But regardless, whether you're reading a newspaper article or a short story, these texts are all conveying perspectives on the world, worldviews, or beliefs about how things are or should be. Now, fictional texts, like the ones we'll be studying later on in this course, convey these arguments or these values by way of themes. Every text is always going to be about something. Romeo and Juliet, one of the most famous examples, is a story about, let's say, love, also about really stupid teenagers who enter into a suicide pact, but that's neither here nor there. Now, the argument that Shakespeare could be making about that subject through the story and the characters and all the literary devices, everything inside that work, could be something like love is an inherently irrational emotion and has to be tightly controlled in order to avoid disaster. That's an argument. It's a view of the world, something that we might agree or disagree with. Whether the story or whether the text is a story, a narrative, a play, a poem, a novel, or whether it is an article or an essay or a newspaper article, it could still convey that same fundamental argument. But there are differences in the ways in which fictional and non-fictional texts, or fiction and non-fiction texts, convey those arguments or attempt to persuade or convince their readers of those arguments. Everything we're going to be talking about in this course boils down to arguments. How arguments are made, how we interpret and analyze the arguments that are presented inside non-fiction texts and fictional texts, and also how we can best articulate our own arguments as to the validity of the arguments in these stories or in these articles, or the nature and the direction of these kinds of arguments. So the takeaway from this is that all texts communicate arguments in ways that are both subtle and overt. Everything tries to convince you of something. Every single text is selling you on a certain set of ideas or beliefs, even if they only underlie the kind of story that's being told. Nonfiction texts, with which we're going to be starting this course, present arguments through rhetorical devices. Rhetoric is just the art of persuasion. So if you look at public speaker, for instance, and think that this woman is incredibly persuasive. She understands how to reach her audience. She's using the art of persuasion, rhetoric. A rhetorical technique or rhetorical device is a kind of strategy or technique that an author uses when trying to convey his argument, or her argument, as the case may be. Fictional texts do the same thing. They have arguments, right, what we would call themes, right? And they convey these arguments by way of literary devices and techniques. These are really just a series of fancy terms that we take and apply to texts to break them down and parse them out. Now, to better explain what I mean by that, I have an example for you. I said that literary devices are essentially just parts of texts. Now, we have academic terms for these parts, things like setting, characterization, symbolism, imagery, diction, which is just word choice inside the story. But the way we look at them and the way we think about them when we're approaching an argument about a story is the same way that we look at, say, parts of films. So if I was to ask you this question, did you enjoy Star Wars The Force Awakens? The appropriate answer is no, because it's just a ripoff of A New Hope, and nothing of any value was added to the Star Wars franchise because of it. But regardless, if I asked you that question, you could look at parts of the film. You could break it down. You could look at the acting, the special effects, the plot, the visual design, the directing. You can think about different pieces of it and organize your thoughts around those central aspects or parts of the film. Literary devices really function in the exact same way. Now, in academic essays at this level, we don't talk about whether we liked a story or we disliked it and the reasons why. But the same approach applies to interpreting the story's meaning. We can break down the story into, let's say, quotations or images from a movie and look at those smaller parts of it. I could say all these quotations relate to one literary device, just as I could say all these different examples I'm talking about relate to the special effects of a movie. And looking at these examples, looking at these quotations from the story, I can put them together and start to interpret them to better understand what the story means or what the story is arguing. Literary devices, like I said, are just parts of stories. And we'll be introducing them one at a time, basically, as we go through this course. This course is organized around initially discussing how arguments are made in nonfiction texts, and then applying what we know from that discussion to fictional texts, which can be a little bit more difficult to interpret because they don't make their arguments explicitly. Rather, they do so subtly through things like plot, characterization, setting, and symbolism. Now, I have a description of these and some examples of the stories that we're going to look at, like Through the Tunnel, in order to explore these particular devices. But suffice to say that literary devices like symbolism, setting, imagery, and characterization, and you can refer to a list of these devices that's posted on Omnivox, are the techniques that authors use to help them convey the kind of emotions and the kinds of arguments that we are interested in. That argument itself is known as a theme. Arguments in fiction are themes. Now, you might have heard that, let's say, love is a theme. I'm using terminology that's slightly different. A subject for us would be love or family or hope. For us, a theme would be the argument the story is making about that subject, what it has to say, or the meaning of the story, or let's say the moral, the point, or the message that the story is trying to convey. Whenever you are looking at a story, at this level, you're looking to get at that message, that point, the meaning of the text. And it's incumbent upon us to analyze the literary devices inside these stories to better understand what the author is trying to say and how he or she is trying to say it. Now, as an example of this process, we can turn to some of the simplest and oldest kinds of stories, Aesop's fables. So, looking at this story, we're asking ourselves, what is the theme, the message, or the argument? A donkey once found a lion's skin which the hunters had left out in the sun to dry. He put it on and went towards his native village. Everyone ran away from him, thinking that he was a lion, and he was incredibly proud. In his delight, he lifted up his voice and brayed, but then everyone knew him, and his owner came out and beat him. Shortly afterwards, a fox came up to him and said, "Ah, I knew you by your voice." So, what we have here, the moral of the story, the message of the story, could be something like the theme: a person cannot change himself by changing his external appearance, because that really doesn't define who you are. Or maybe the ass, the donkey, the fool, a fool will always be found out. What I'd like you to do is take a look at the next Aesop's fable and try to do the same thing. What is the theme, the moral, or the message of this story? And what you're doing subconsciously as you think about this question is you're looking at things like the characterization of these people that are in the story, how they change, how they grow, what motivates them, what they want, and what they end up getting. You're looking at symbolism or imagery, right? Like the image of a donkey, the fool, like this characteristic or stereotypical, prototypical image of the fool. Language used, the plot, what happens to the characters, and the like. So, the old man and death. An old man, bent with age and hard work, was gathering sticks in a forest. At last he grew so tired and hopeless that he threw down the bundle of sticks and cried out, "I cannot bear this life any longer. Ah, I wish that death would come and take me." As he spoke, Death, a grisly skeleton, appeared and said to him, "What do you want, mortal? I heard you call me." "Please, sir," replied the woodcutter, "would you kindly help me lift the bundle of sticks to my shoulder?" Take about 2 minutes, pause the video, and try to answer that question. What is the moral, the message, or the theme of this story? And how do you know it? All right. So there are many possible answers because stories don't just have one theme. They have multiple subjects like death, old age, hard work, who knows? But they have also multiple arguments that could be articulated surrounding those subjects. One possible theme from the story is that people often wish for things that they don't truly want because they don't consider the consequences of receiving them. So when I look at this story and I think about the character, what motivates him, right? He's so tired he wants to die. And then when he is confronted with death, he doesn't really want it anymore. I can extract this moral, this principle, this set of values, or this theme, the argument of the text from the work. What we'll be doing throughout the rest of the course is pretty much exactly that, just at varying levels of complexity and with varying degrees of analysis. But to start us off on that process, we're going to be taking a look at Aristotle's rhetorical triangle. These rhetorical appeals, or Aristotle's rhetorical triangle, are techniques of persuasion. They're broad scale or broad brush descriptions of the various ways in which speakers or advertisers can attempt to persuade us to accept a set of ideas or perhaps to purchase a product or service. They don't necessarily make an argument true, but they help to convince us of a speaker's positions. These three are ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos is an appeal to character. You can think of the term ethics, from whence, which derives from this original term, this Greek term. Ethos is the appeal to likability of a character, or the character and trustworthiness of the individual who's speaking. Pathos is an appeal to emotion, so effective imagery or the like, that motivates us to accept what somebody's saying, not because it's true or because we like the person, but because our emotions, our heartstrings have been tugged. And then logos. Logos is the appeal to reason, right? The appeal to your logical sense of things. Ethos is an appeal to character. So if you believe that a speaker is credible or is an authority on a subject, if you believe that he is fair or likable, suddenly you're more inclined to believe what he has to say, even if the argument that he presents or the ideas that he presents aren't necessarily substantiated. For instance, you probably are more inclined to accept what I have to say because I'm a teacher. I am an expert in this subject area. Nothing that I tell you is actually backed up by any kind of objective external information. You're taking what I have to say as true, in large part, because of the context in which we find ourselves and because of the position that I occupy relative to you as a student. Right? Ethos can be based on reputation. For instance, if you know that I have a reputation as a good teacher, then you might be inclined to accept what I have to say. Or if I have poor ethos, if my ethos is incredibly limited because, well, you know, you've heard bad things about me and he's not a very good teacher. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Hopefully, hopefully that's not true. But if you had heard that, then suddenly I wouldn't be very trustworthy and you wouldn't be inclined to accept what I have to say or to accept my positions. And there are many different ways that you can approach the development of ethos that are listed here. If you take a look at the Allstate insurance ad linked in the description of this video, you'll see an example of a commercial and advertisement that is based almost wholly on ethos. It's based on the company selling itself due to its sterling reputation. Reputation is essentially the crux of ethos. The appeal to reason is an appeal to logical argumentation. If you appear reasonable, you can persuade your audience to actually accept what you have to say. Now, logos, or the appeal to reason, is really the only one of these three rhetorical techniques that actually pertains to the strength and validity of the argument that you're trying to make, or the point that you're trying to persuade your reader or audience to adopt. Now, to support logos, to support the appeal to reason, we can use things like statistics, testimony, facts about the world, or the like. However, those things in themselves are not logos. Rather, the presentation of these kinds of things in the form of an argument itself, a logically constructed argument, is reason, or is the appeal to reason. It is logos. So just giving you data or numbers isn't in itself the appeal to reason. I have to take that data, take those numbers, and then fit them into a logical developmental argument to actually appeal to logic and reason. So, for instance, a sample kind of argument here that I would have to back up with facts and statistics that I would draw upon, but those would only be the supplemental pieces in the appeal to reason, would be something like, we do not have enough money to pay for improvements to our railroads. Without improvements, the transport system will falter and thus hinder our economy. Therefore, we should raise taxes to pay for better railroads because it's actually more effective and more economically viable in the long run. Another example of logos is in this advertisement for an Apple iPad. This advertisement ran under the slogan "thinner than ever." The argument that they're making, the argument that they're trying to use to persuade you, is that this iPad is thinner and lighter than the previous model. Smaller personal items are easier to carry. Easy to carry items are convenient. Thus, you should buy the new iPad because it's more convenient. They're trying to appeal to your sense of convenience and comfort by making a logical argument about why you should purchase this object. You also have probably the most effective, but let's say the most underhanded approach to convincing people to adopt your perspective: the appeal to emotion, or pathos. Pathos plays upon an audience sympathies, their imagination, their ability to empathize with other people. I try to inspire in you, my listener, an emotional reaction, whether that be amusement, outrage, joy, happiness, in order to connect those feelings with the product that I'm selling. And if you take a look at the Maddie video that is posted in the description to this video, you'll see an example of that kind of approach. Pause the video, take a look at that commercial, and then return. All right, so what you have in that video is functionally the argument: here's a cute dog, now buy our car. It's playing on your emotional sentiments. In fact, it's playing and preying upon all those different positive associations and memories that you have of owning pets. Things that could be considered ethos, the appeal to emotion. The use of scare tactics, usually involving catastrophic consequences for a failure to adopt a particular course of action. Or it might be an appeal to, let's say, patriotic sentiments or the like, using loaded terms, or evocative imagery. Other kinds of rhetorical devices. You can have an anecdote, a brief story that's not necessarily personal, but it's meant to support the author's position. You can correct erroneous views, and this kind of falls into the broad category of logos, but it involves the correction of something that you see as wrong in the arguments that are made by other people, and thus you buttress your own argument by anticipating counterpoints and addressing them. An appeal to patriotism, which is fundamentally the appeal to emotion. Bandwagoning, when you simply assert that, well, everyone's doing this, or most people believe this, and it is the accepted position of experts or the general population. So you don't want to be different from other people. You don't want to sort of buck the trend, right? You must be wrong if everyone else agrees or disagrees with you. Concession, where you actually make it seem as if you are a reasonable and level-headed individual by suggesting that certain aspects of your opponent's arguments or positions are valid. And if you do so, then suddenly your own position appears all the stronger because it seems as if you're giving the opposing position a fair hearing. Powerful imagery, things that stand out in the reader's minds. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as we move on to examples of articles that use these kinds of rhetorical techniques. So, major takeaways from this video lecture. Key points. All texts convey arguments, whether they're fiction or nonfiction. And we're starting in this class with the analysis of nonfiction texts because they state their arguments directly. They convey those arguments through, in the case of nonfiction texts, rhetorical devices and techniques, and through the case of, or in the case of fictional texts, through literary devices. Rhetorical devices that we've studied thus far are appeals to emotion, logic, and character. We are going to be using this background information about how themes work, about how arguments work in the kinds of articles that we'll be reading in the first few weeks of the course in order to develop our understanding of arguments and then apply them to fictional works. Once we understand how we can look at examples from nonfiction texts, articles, look at these techniques and break them down to categorize them and organize them, then we can do the same thing, apply those same techniques to literary texts to better understand how authors of fictional works or poems use things like symbolism, setting, characterization, all these parts or pieces of stories to articulate and convey beliefs about the world, arguments about the world, morals of the stories, or themes.